Let's turn time back to around the year 2020, where one of the funniest team explosions in the history of the league happened. You see, right as COVID was hitting the world, nobody was sure on what to do. The league initially let the 2020 season continue while attempting to be as cautious as possible. This brings us to a few months into the pandemic. On the day of a regular season road trip matchup in March of that year, Rudy Gobert is seen being a little too playful when being interviewed. As he's asked about the COVID restrictions, Rudy touches all of the mics near him to try to be funny and make a joke about how serious people were taking this new and unknown virus. Turns out that while he did that, Rudy Gobert was actually sick with COVID yet didn't know it. This highly publicized screw-up essentially made it so that the league had to shut down and postpone the rest of the season almost immediately. This was bad enough publicity for Rudy, but he actually did more lasting and permanent damage than meets the eye, mainly to his team, the Utah Jazz. After the mic touching incident, it actually came out that Rudy was being intentionally obnoxious in the locker room during that same road trip. He was essentially getting really close to people and touching their belongings or lightly spitting to try to be a funny guy. Of course, since he actually had COVID, this was disastrous. He ended up getting his co-star and a guy who was already pissed at him, Donovan Mitchell, sick with COVID. This would eventually break up the two stars in around a year, getting them both sent to different teams. This incident slowly killed the Utah Jazz, but was the blow-up warranted? To give some history on these two, Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, the stars of the small-market Utah Jazz, played together since Donovan got drafted in 2017. Together, they propelled this team to compete with the top Western teams year after year, at least in the regular season. While the team did appear successful and well put together on the surface, there were more than a few problems with the team that never got sorted and only got worse in the post-COVID era. This is proven through their lack of playoff success in any of the years they were playing together. For the underlying issues, you could tell Donovan Mitchell never really respected Rudy's game. For a large portion of their partnership, D-Mitch barely passed the ball to Rudy. Despite Mitchell working to increase his assist numbers every year, his assist numbers to Rudy seemed to drop every year. It got to a point where Trae Young was averaging more assists to his center Clint Capella than Donovan Mitchell was averaging passes to Rudy Gobert. When confronted about this, Donovan Mitchell claimed he always tries to make the right play, which is essentially a passive-aggressive way of saying that the ball didn't belong in Rudy's hands on offense. Of course, it didn't help that the two stars butted heads about almost everything. Rudy didn't like how Donovan was running the offense and was known to criticize his passing ability. Donovan thought Rudy was an overpaid scrub who could barely dribble a basketball, which isn't entirely wrong. Essentially, tensions were always high on this team in terms of the stars. The Utah Jazz were a volcano just waiting to blow. It only took an incident like this to kick off the real drama. As we talked about earlier, Rudy had his super spreader incident that got Mitchell sick. If this never happened, there is a chance that the two players work things out and we see them on the Utah Jazz today. Unfortunately, it did happen though. Donovan Mitchell ended up getting extremely sick and it came out that he was refusing to answer any sort of text or call from Rudy. The Jazz even tried to step in and make the two players attend virtual meetings or workouts. Now it was Rudy though, who was refusing to talk to Donovan until the two made up. This whole mess on the Jazz was made 100 times worse. So basically, given that this team was a pressure cooker from the beginning, that pressure finally built up a little too much from the COVID incidents and the team was now in panic mode. Despite having a great team on paper, things were now at an all-time low for the Jazz.
Despite all the infighting surrounding the Jazz around the COVID stoppage, they still managed to make it to the bubble and closed out the season a little better than what most people expected. However, all of that would come apart in the playoffs like usual. Donovan Mitchell and Jamal Murray would have a pretty crazy battle, with Donovan going off for multiple 50-point games, carrying the struggling Jazz to a 7-game series. At which point it looked pretty clear that D-Mitch was clearly gassed, as well as Jamal Murray. But Jamal Murray had Jokic still ready and primed to go, whereas Donovan just couldn't rely on Rudy whatsoever, as he allowed Jokic to go off for 30 and 14, and down the stretch of the second half where the Nuggets were clearly starting to slip, the Jazz just couldn't step up and take advantage. Again, partially due to Rudy Gobert. The Jazz would go on to get knocked out, and the Nuggets would go on to face the eventual NBA champs in the Western Conference Finals. But for the Nuggets, they were just getting started on their hopeful dynasty push. And the Jazz at this point were spent. But they would carry on for the next 2 seasons as middle-of-the-pack contenders who everyone kind of knew were no real threats, until the strain between the two stars brewed up to a point where it was clear that they needed to split the team up, despite the front office making every attempt to curb those rumors. But it turned out they really didn't even need to do that. At the time, it appeared that the sale of the Minnesota Timberwolves to A-Rod and his business partner Mark Lowry was all but guaranteed. That would turn out to be the farthest thing from the truth, but at the time, the new prospective future owners were excited to jump in early and begin building their team around their then sophomore star Anthony Edwards. And so a massive deal was reached, seeing Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Walker Kessler, Jared Vanderbilt, and 4 first-round picks, all sent to the Jazz for Rudy Gobert. In hindsight, this deal does seem like it somewhat worked out, but at the time it was seen as a massive overpay. And really, that's the context it should be viewed in as we talk about it right now. Yes, the Timberwolves are good, but they didn't need to give away all of those assets, especially the 4 first-round picks. And that's why this trade is seemed to be the cause of the new owner syndrome, where new owners excited to hit the ground running throw the bag at any slight hope of making their team more competitive. Similar to what we saw with Joe Tsai and the Nets. For the Jazz, however, this was obviously a massive win, and could also be a slight testament to the talent of their new GM, Danny Ainge. And so by all appearances, it looked like the Jazz were kind of prepping up for full rebuild mode. But still, they were insistent that that rebuild would still include Donovan Mitchell. And with the team at the top of D. Mitch's wish list, the New York Knicks, signing Jalen Brunson, it kind of looked like there might be some truth to Danny Ainge's claims. But then, a little over a month before the 2022-23 season was set to start, the Jazz would make one final move in the step toward rebuilding, as it was announced that the Spider was being sent to the Cleveland Cavaliers. In exchange, the Jazz would receive 3 first-round picks with a couple of pick swaps, as well as Ochai Agbaji, Colin Sexton, and their current franchise cornerstone, Lauri Markkanen. Looking back on this offseason in the eyes of the Jazz, you really couldn't have pulled off a more successful couple of trades. But that could all change if the Jazz and Markkanen can't reach an agreement on a long-term extension, which is currently looming over the franchise. Hopefully they can get a deal done, but as far as their Rudy replacement Walker Kessler, it did appear like he was going to fit those shoes perfectly, already averaging more blocks a game than Rudy was in just his rookie season. But despite that promising show, Coach Will Hardy wasn't willing to increase his minutes, averaging 23 minutes of play in his rookie season, and now just 23.3 minutes last season. Despite this, he was still able to average the second most blocks per game, proving his defensive prowess once again. As we mentioned for the Timberwolves, the Rudy Gobert trade also looks to be a win-win situation, as behind the trio of Rudy, Anthony Edwards, and Karl Anthony Towns, the Timberwolves were able to finish 3rd in the extremely tough Western Conference, even knocking out the former champion Denver Nuggets. But although Rudy was pretty essential in the regular season, he once again started to crap out once they got deeper in the playoffs. So we'll see if Anthony Edwards' continued ascension is enough to hide Rudy should he decide to disappear once again. Looking at the Cavs and how the trade shaped up for them, it's kind of been up and down. Before the trade, it did appear as though Darius Garland was prepped to take the next step forward in potentially becoming a franchise point guard. But since the arrival of Donovan Mitchell, that progression has been somewhat halted, and now it does kind of seem like Donovan's tenure in Cleveland isn't exactly guaranteed. And if he chooses to leave for another team, like, maybe the Miami Heat, it could be kind of difficult for the team going forward despite the assets they have on paper. All said and done, we're only 2 seasons removed from the Rudy Donovan-led Jazz team breaking up, but somehow it feels like a lifetime ago, with both players in their own right going back to their projected past and becoming impactful players on their own respective rosters. Which begs the question, did the Jazz move a little too early breaking this team up instead of just waiting for the 2 stars to mend their rifts? No, they didn't. The Jazz moved at the perfect time, recognizing their stagnation and moving off the 2 stars before they would start to appear desperate in the trade market, or lose them altogether in free agency. The problem the Jazz had during those years went deeper than just Rudy rubbing a couple of microphones. The team was bottoming out and becoming very predictable. The microphone incident was just the straw that broke the camel's back. Apart, the two flourish, but neither is the co-star that the other requires. Proven by how much more successful Donovan has been with a more diverse big man in Evan Mobley, and the success that Rudy has found, playing alongside a big that opens up the floor like Karl Anthony Towns, and a guard that is willing to commit more on the defensive end to fill the gaps Rudy may have. Either way you look at it, the fall of the regular season Grim Reapers, Utah Jazz, is a story for the books, and definitely one of the more fun storylines to look back within the NBA. So if you enjoyed this story and video, feel free to give it a like. While down there, you might as well just subscribe and let us know in the comments how you feel about this era of the Utah Jazz. And as for that, we'll see you next week for the next upload.